Ethan had been married to Claire for almost 7 years. It hadn't always been like this. Routine, distant, and lacking passion. There had been a time when he could remember how it felt to look into her eyes and feel a spark, the kind of connection that made everything else fade into the background. But those moments had become rare, and he couldn't remember the last time they had really talked, really felt anything for each other. It was a Friday night when Ethan boarded the flight to the conference, leaving behind the quiet of his home and the tension in his marriage. Claire had kissed him goodbye earlier that morning, as she always did, but there had been no warmth behind the gesture. She hadn't asked about his trip, and Ethan hadn't mentioned it. It was just another day, just another routine. As Ethan boarded the plane for his business trip, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his marriage pressing down on him. The familiar tension that had been building for months, maybe even years, was hard to ignore. It wasn't that he didn't love Claire, but something inside him had shifted. Their connection, once a source of joy, had become a distant memory. The quiet, repetitive nature of their life together made him feel more like a roommate than a husband. For the first time in a long while, he questioned whether he could continue living like this. The thought of divorce seemed too final, too permanent, and yet the idea of staying in a stagnant marriage felt suffocating. The conference was a brief escape, a way to break free from the monotony. Ethan had always found business trips to be a sort of refuge from his real life. Away from the obligations of home, he could breathe a little easier, even if it was only temporary. But as he sat in his hotel room, staring at the polished surfaces and empty space, he realized how empty the escape truly was. His loneliness echoed in the sterile room, and for a moment, he thought about calling Claire just to hear her voice, but the thought quickly faded. What would they talk about anyway? The same small talk they always made about work, the weather, the dullness of their lives. Sophie entered the picture almost by accident. She was a colleague of a colleague, someone who had come to the conference to represent a different company. At first, Ethan thought of her as just another professional face. Pleasant, competent, but nothing more. But as the hours passed and they began to chat over drinks at the hotel bar, something clicked. Sophie was lively and spontaneous in a way Ethan hadn't experienced in years. She was full of energy, eager to talk about anything and everything, with an openness that made him feel seen. He found himself laughing at her jokes, intrigued by her stories, and captivated by the way she made him feel alive again. Sophie didn't know about his marriage, and Ethan was too wrapped up in the conversation to care about the implications. He wasn't thinking about Claire. Not then. Not when Sophie's presence filled the room with an intensity he hadn't felt in months. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt desired. Sophie's flirtations were subtle at first. Lingering glances, touches on the arm, a playful tone. But Ethan, starved for affection, read into every move. As they talked about their careers, their dreams, and their frustrations, Ethan felt an intoxicating connection. It was like he had stepped into a world where he was still young, still passionate, still someone worth chasing. And Sophie, for her part, seemed to be genuinely interested in him. Her laugh was easy, her smile infectious, and the energy between them felt effortless. Ethan told himself it was harmless fun, just two people sharing a drink and a conversation. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He knew what was happening, but he couldn't stop it. He had waited so long to feel something again. By the time they reached Sophie's hotel room, the boundaries between politeness and attraction had blurred. Sophie didn't press Ethan, but she made it clear that she was open to whatever came next. Ethan, unsure but emboldened by the alcohol and the emotional connection, agreed to stay. The room was small but cozy, and Sophie turned on some soft music, poured them both another drink, and continued the conversation. There was no rush, no pressure, just a slow dance of words, laughter, and subtle touches. Ethan found himself getting lost in the moment, caught up in the allure of being desired, of being wanted in a way that felt foreign after so many years of routine. When they kissed, it was like a spark had been lit. Ethan's body betrayed him, the desire bubbling up inside him despite the voice of reason screaming in his head. "You're married. This is wrong." But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. The guilt came later, as it always does, but for now, Ethan was drowning in the rush of the forbidden. The night unfolded in a blur of passion, a fleeting escape from his life. Sophie didn't judge him, didn't ask questions, and Ethan didn't volunteer any answers. As the night wore on, their connection deepened, and Ethan found himself doing something he thought he would never do. He slept with another woman. The next morning, when the light of day returned, so did the weight of Ethan's actions. Sophie was still warm beside him, her breathing soft, but the room felt different now. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the guilt that had been buried beneath the surface now surged forward. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Ethan's thoughts began to spiral. How could I have done this? He wondered. What have I done to Claire? He couldn't even bring himself to look at Sophie. Her kindness, her understanding felt suffocating now, a reminder of the mistake he had made. He knew he had crossed a line, but the shame and the self-loathing didn't hit him until he was already dressed and about to leave. Sophie, still half asleep, kissed him on the cheek and said, "Maybe we'll see each other again." Ethan didn't answer, too consumed by his thoughts to form the words. The walk back to his own hotel room felt like the longest journey of his life. Every step echoed in his mind. You betrayed her. You betrayed yourself. Returning home felt like a slap in the face. Claire didn't know, of course, but Ethan could feel the distance between them widening with each passing day. The guilt ate at him, gnawing at his insides, making him irritable and distant. He tried to act normal, tried to pretend that nothing had changed, but Claire could tell. She noticed the long silences during dinner, the way he withdrew after their brief conversations. He wasn't the same. Ethan knew it. Claire knew it, and neither of them had the courage to face it. Ethan spent hours at work, throwing himself into projects as a distraction. He avoided thinking about what he'd done, but his thoughts inevitably circled back to Sophie, to the feeling of her touch, the rush of excitement. But it was always followed by the crushing guilt. What did he want? He didn't know. He wasn't sure if he wanted to fix his marriage or if he was just too afraid to face the truth that it had fallen apart. The silence between him and Claire had become deafening. The small moments of affection had evaporated, replaced by awkward conversations and an overwhelming sense of disconnection. Claire noticed the changes. Ethan was different. More distant, less affectionate. One evening after a quiet dinner, she confronted him. "Ethan, what's going on?" Claire asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You've been so cold lately. What happened? Are we okay?" Ethan froze. The words he had been avoiding for weeks bubbled to the surface. He opened his mouth to speak, but found that no words came out. The guilt was suffocating. Claire, sensing something was terribly wrong, pressed on. "Ethan, if there's something you need to tell me, now is the time. I can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it clearly isn't." Ethan's heart raced. The secret he had kept for so long was out there now. He had a choice. Lie and protect himself, or tell the truth and face the consequences. The truth burned his throat as he whispered, I made a mistake. I slept with someone else." The air in the room seemed to freeze. Claire's face turned pale, her hand trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. The words hung in the air, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything. The silence that followed Ethan's confession was deafening. It was as though the room itself had absorbed the words he had just spoken, and the weight of them hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Claire stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. The hurt was instantaneous, overwhelming, and she could barely comprehend what had just happened. I don't even know what to say," Claire whispered, her voice trembling as if every word caused her physical pain. "You slept with someone else? After everything? After all we've been through?" Ethan's throat tightened. He had expected the pain in her voice, but hearing it felt like a punch to his chest. He had been dreading this moment for weeks, but the reality of it was even worse than he had imagined. His stomach churned with regret. "I'm so sorry, Claire," Ethan said, his voice cracking. I never meant to hurt you. I I was lost. I don't know what happened. I didn't know what to do. Claire's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. Lost? She echoed. You were lost? You think that makes it okay? You think that somehow justifies what you did? I don't even recognize you right now. The anger in her voice was sharp, but beneath it, Ethan could hear the depth of her heartbreak. Claire had always been the steady, rational one, but this was different. This wasn't just betrayal. It was the shattering of everything they had built together. The trust, the love, the intimacy. All of it was gone in an instant. Ethan stood there, paralyzed, as Claire turned away from him, her hands trembling as she wiped away the tears that had begun to fall. His mind raced, but no words seemed right. How could he explain himself? How could he possibly make up for what he had done? I know I can't take it back, Claire, Ethan said, his voice barely audible. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you to let me fix this. I'll do anything, I swear. Claire turned back to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and anger. Anything? She asked, her voice sharp. Do you think anything will make me forget that you betrayed me? That you thought it was okay to just walk away from us and into the arms of another woman? You don't get to do that, Ethan. You don't get to come back and expect everything to be fine. Ethan's heart sank. He had feared this exact response, but it felt worse than anything he had imagined. He could feel the distance growing between them, distance that had never been there before. He had always taken Claire's love for granted, but now, standing before her, he realized how fragile it all was. He had torn their world apart with one reckless decision. I know, Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I know I can't undo it. I didn't know what else to do. I was so desperate to feel something again, to feel alive. Claire's eyes softened for a moment, but the hurt was still there. You think a one-night stand could fix that? She asked bitterly. You think sleeping with someone else would suddenly make you feel alive again? Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What could he say? What could possibly justify his actions? I don't know how we move forward from this, Claire continued, her voice quiet but resolute. I need time, Ethan. I need to figure out if this is even worth saving. If you're worth saving. The days that followed were an emotional whirlwind for Ethan. Claire had told him she needed space, but it didn't make the emptiness any easier to bear. They had barely spoken in the days after the confrontation, and when they did, it was always awkward, strained. Ethan spent hours pacing their house, agonizing over what he had done, what he had lost. His guilt ate at him, gnawing at him from the inside out. He couldn't stop thinking about that night with Sophie. How easily it had happened. How quickly he had allowed himself to be swept up in the moment. The shame of it all felt suffocating, and every time he thought about Claire, he felt like he was drowning. How could he have betrayed her like that? How could he have risked everything? His marriage, his home, his future? For a fleeting moment of passion. But the guilt wasn't the only thing that plagued him. There was also the haunting question. Why had he done it in the first place? What had driven him to seek solace in someone else's arms? He had been dissatisfied with his marriage, yes, but that wasn't an excuse. The affair had been a way for him to escape, to avoid facing the deeper issues he had with himself and with Claire. But now, it was clear to him that he had been running from the wrong things. The pain wasn't just about the marriage, it was about his own unresolved issues, his fear of vulnerability, and his inability to communicate honestly with Claire. As for Claire, she was torn. The betrayal cut deeper than anything she had ever experienced, and she struggled to come to terms with it. The anger she had felt in the immediate aftermath had softened, but it hadn't disappeared. The pain of knowing that Ethan had sought someone else when she had always been there for him was overwhelming. She had given him everything. Her love, her trust, her time. And this is how he repaid her? But there was also the part of Claire that was heartbroken for the man she had married. She knew that Ethan had been struggling, that their marriage had been in trouble long before the affair, but it didn't make it any easier. How could she trust him again after this? How could she ever look at him without seeing the betrayal hanging over them? She had always been someone who believed in second chances, in the possibility of redemption, but this felt different. It felt like something had been irrevocably broken, something that could never be fixed. In the days that followed, Claire found herself lost in thought, wondering if there was even a way forward. Could they rebuild their marriage? Could she ever forgive him? Or had their love become so fragile that it was beyond repair? Ethan knew that he had to take responsibility for his actions. He couldn't change the past, but he could change how he moved forward. The first step was acknowledging his mistakes. Not just the affair, but the way he had allowed his marriage to fall apart without ever truly confronting the issues. He realized that his emotional distance from Claire had been building for years, and the affair was just the symptom of a deeper problem. His fear of intimacy and his inability to communicate his needs. In the weeks that followed, Ethan worked hard to show Claire that he was committed to making things right. He sought therapy on his own, determined to understand why he had acted the way he did. He learned about his own emotional walls, the defense mechanisms he had built over the years to avoid vulnerability. It wasn't just the marriage that needed repair. It was himself. But even with all the self-reflection, Ethan knew that the road to redemption wasn't easy. He had to prove to Claire that he could be the partner she deserved, and that would take time, patience, and unwavering commitment. Over time, Claire and Ethan began to have more open and honest conversations. The hurt didn't disappear overnight, but there were moments when they began to reconnect, when the love that had once brought them together resurfaced in small ways. They started attending couples therapy, learning how to communicate more effectively and confront their issues head-on. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the pain resurfaced, but both of them were committed to rebuilding, one step at a time. Ethan had learned that real change comes not from escaping into someone else's arms, but from facing the truth about yourself and the person you love. He had to earn back Claire's trust, not just with words, but with actions. It would take time, perhaps a long time. But there was a glimmer of hope that they could find their way back to each other, even after everything they had been through. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Ethan believed that there was a chance for healing, a chance to rebuild, not just his marriage, but his own sense of integrity and self-worth. After their initial confrontation, Ethan and Claire began couples therapy, a decision that wasn't easy for either of them. Claire had been hesitant at first, unsure whether it was even worth the effort. The wound was still fresh, and the idea of sharing their most intimate thoughts and fears with a stranger felt uncomfortable. But Ethan had insisted, promising that he was committed to doing whatever it took to fix what he had broken. The first few sessions were tense, filled with silence and unspoken resentments. Claire was still raw from the betrayal, and Ethan's guilt weighed heavily on him. He found it difficult to open up fully, afraid that any admission of weakness would only push Claire further away. Yet, slowly but surely, their therapist helped them navigate through the tangled web of emotions. In their first session, the therapist gently asked Claire how she felt about Ethan's affair. Her voice wavered as she answered, "I feel like I don't even know him anymore. The man I married, he's not the same person. I don't know if I can trust him again." Ethan, sitting across from her, felt his chest tighten at her words. He wanted to reach out, to explain that he wasn't the same person either, that he had changed, that he was trying to become someone better. But the therapist intervened, urging him to listen rather than speak. "Ethan," she said softly, "this is Claire's time to express her pain. You need to hear her fully." Claire continued, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I loved him with everything I had, and he betrayed that love. It's like I gave him a piece of myself, and he handed it off to someone else without a second thought." Ethan's heart ached. He had never fully understood how much Claire had invested in their marriage until now. He realized that she had trusted him completely, and he had shattered that trust. The guilt was unbearable, but it was also the first step toward acknowledging the damage he had caused. The weeks that followed were a blur of difficult conversations, tear-filled nights, and quiet moments of reflection. There were days when they both questioned whether they could truly move past the betrayal. Claire was still struggling with the idea of forgiveness, unsure if she could ever let go of the pain. And Ethan, despite his earnest attempts to make amends, often felt like he was walking on eggshells, afraid that any wrong move would push Claire further away. But gradually, Claire began to see changes in Ethan. He wasn't the man who had been so distant and emotionally unavailable before. He was showing up, emotionally present, vulnerable in ways he had never been before. He started taking responsibility for his actions, not just in words, but in how he lived his life. He made small but significant changes, opening up about his feelings, acknowledging his shortcomings, and being patient with Claire's healing process. Ethan also realized that his affair had been a symptom of his deeper issues: his inability to communicate his needs, his fear of vulnerability, and his avoidance of emotional intimacy. Therapy helped him unravel these patterns and begin to address them, not just in his marriage, but within himself. He worked on building emotional resilience, learning how to be more present with Claire, and how to build trust again from the ground up. Despite their efforts, the road to rebuilding trust was rocky. Claire would sometimes find herself replaying the memory of Ethan's betrayal in her mind, her heart aching all over again. She would catch herself questioning every word he said, every action he took. Was he really committed to change, or was this just temporary? Was the man sitting across from her now the same person who had broken her heart? There were moments when the doubt crept in, when the pain felt too much to bear. Ethan could see it in her eyes, the hesitation, the guardedness. She wasn't sure if she could trust him again, and frankly, neither was he. There were days when the shadow of the affair felt like it would consume them both. But slowly they learned to rebuild their relationship piece by piece. They found new ways to communicate, less defensively, more honestly. They learned to listen, not just to each other's words, but to each other's hearts. It wasn't perfect, and there were still days when the weight of what had happened seemed overwhelming, but they were learning how to navigate the complexities of forgiveness and trust. As time went on, Claire began to wrestle with a question that had been haunting her from the start. Could she ever forgive Ethan? The hurt still felt raw, and the memories of betrayal lingered in her mind. But she also saw how much effort Ethan was putting into changing, into making things right. He wasn't asking for forgiveness right away. He was allowing her the time she needed to process and heal. For Claire, the decision wasn't easy. Forgiveness wasn't a switch that could be flipped. It wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about accepting the possibility of moving forward, even though the past still haunted them. Every time she thought about Ethan's affair, the pain was sharp, but over time it dulled slightly. In therapy, Claire learned that forgiveness didn't mean excusing what Ethan had done. It meant choosing to release the anger and pain that had held her captive. It was a choice to stop letting the betrayal define their future. And though it wasn't easy, Claire began to slowly make that choice. "I'm still angry, Ethan," Claire said one evening after a therapy session. "But I think I'm starting to see that I can't let this consume me. I want to try, for us. But it's going to take time." Ethan nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I don't deserve you, Claire, but I'm not going to give up on us. I'm going to keep showing you that I'm here, that I'm worth trusting again. You don't have to forgive me right away, but I hope one day I can earn it." As the months went by, their relationship began to feel different. It wasn't the same as it had been before the affair, but it was growing stronger in a new way. Ethan and Claire found moments of joy again, laughter that wasn't tainted by guilt or bitterness. They shared new experiences, rediscovered things about each other they had forgotten, and began to build a future that was founded on honesty, vulnerability, and trust. They still had difficult conversations, still faced moments of doubt and insecurity, but they were committed to working through them together. The journey wasn't linear, and there were setbacks, but the growth they had experienced was undeniable. Ethan and Claire had come to understand that healing was a process, a long, sometimes painful one. but it was also one that could bring them closer than they had ever been before. And as they stood together, hand in hand, on the precipice of a new chapter in their relationship, they knew that while the road ahead would be uncertain, they were no longer alone. They had each other, and together they would face whatever came next. Whatever came